Once a month, the Reserve Bank meets and sets interest rates, the official interest rates for the month. And everyone wants to know what's going on. Is their mortgage rate going to go up? Is it going to go down? But the Reserve Bank does much more than that. Afterwards, it releases its minutes to tell us the thinking behind its decision. And it also releases a great set of charts, the RBA chart pack. And this is freely available information. The problem is, how do you interpret it? What are they actually getting at? That's what I want to ask Australia's leading housing economist, Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of My Housing Market. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, welcome to you too.
Well, recently the Reserve Bank released its minutes for its September meeting. Yes. And there were some interesting findings. What did you make of it?
Well, it was interesting, Michael. Usually those minutes signal the same sort of theme in terms of recent meetings, so nothing materially changes, although obviously we've seen some changes with the turnaround in interest rate predictions from up to down. And of course, we've had those cuts. But the Reserve Bank gave us its first, I guess, indication of how it feels those interest rate cuts in June and July have impacted the economy. And clearly it's not happy with that impact, and not just the interest rate cuts, but also those income tax refunds, I guess we could call them, that were passed out to Australian taxpayers earlier in the year as well. And they're suggesting that there's been no sign of improvement. In fact, if anything, there is a decline in that, particularly obviously domestic consumption, which is what they're trying to reactivate. And of course, at the end of the day, that means that they are prepared to cut again.
Well, there's been no noticeable lift in consumer spending, despite what you said, the interest rate cuts and the tax refund, but there has been an increase in consumer sentiment towards property. So on the one hand, it's getting an unintended result of more people interested in property because it doesn't want a boom to happen, but it's not getting the result at once of increasing wages, Andrew.
That's right, Michael. And I guess there's a clear message to the Reserve Bank here that perhaps it was a little bit too focused, as we've constantly said here, on what's happening in housing markets, perhaps at the expense of the macro economy. And that's when it kept interest rates too high for too long, in my opinion, and also was quite actively supporting those APRA actions, which actually increased interest rates. Now, of course, with not just the national economy still looking quite insipid, particularly domestic consumption, but the international economy is now also sliding backwards, that the Reserve Bank really is now having to completely focus on the macro economy in terms of its interest rate settings. And of course, as you've suggested, and no surprise, sentiment for property is on the rise. We've got strengthening housing markets, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney. Momentum is growing in those markets. We will see, I believe, prices growth now in positive territory continuing through the rest of the year. But I think that that's now something that, as an issue, that the Reserve Bank are going to put on the back burner, although I'm not sure, given that we've had all these cuts to rates, we've had 2 in a row, June, July, nothing's happened. I'm not sure what they expect to happen with more cuts, why it should actually get the results thereafter when they haven't got the results so far. And we really haven't seen results in any of the global similar economies, advanced economy. Maybe we've got to rethink the whole nature of monetary policy and not throw out the baby with the bathwater, and particularly not throw out some spare capacity with monetary policy in case there is a continual downturn in the international economy.
Well, we're trying to get our economy working better. There's one way of doing it, making people more productive. And I'm not sure that's going to happen a lot. The other is to get more people into the system. And at the same time, some commentators are suggesting Australia's already full stop, more people coming into the country, but we want people who are skilled, who are in household formation age, to come in and grease the wheels of industry, to buy things, to pay taxes, don't we?
Well, yes, Michael, but I guess the other end of that stick is that it creates more competition for labour. But as you so rightly said, Michael, we do need that migrants to fuel economic activity, which it does, and it's been a strong driver of our economy over the last few years, and well, really traditionally, but certainly hasn't acted as a positive for incomes growth. So it's a slight conundrum, and I guess it's all about where you situate your migration levels.
The other way of increasing the economy is the government spending more. It's currently in surplus, or it's going to become that way. It's getting good income from taxes. It's getting good income from our exports. What else can the government do to get the economy working again?
So obviously, we're all going to switch to fiscal policy sooner rather than later, and the Reserve Bank is almost pleading with the government to start spending more. Government's really, I guess, locked into a positive budget outcome. It's using that as, a political weapon to say that after a lengthy period, we now have a budget surplus. But I'm not sure that's sort of good news to Joe Public out there, who's continuing to see low growth in wages and having to delve into their savings just to survive. So I think that we need to start spending our surplus, and maybe a little bit more than our surplus. I'm not sure that's just infrastructure projects, Michael. Yes, they are a positive for our capacity as nation building, and they do produce labour, but infrastructure doesn't tend to be as labour intensive as typically construction and typically residential construction is. And of course, with those tightening lending conditions over the past few years, we've seen a virtual abandonment of residential construction and also commercial construction. We've got to start thinking about more tax cuts to really work our way into that budget surplus and maybe back into deficit, and give households more money in their pockets through tax cuts.
Well, consumers are concerned. The most recent ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Index is at the lowest level for 2 years. So they're reading the same things you and I are, and they're hearing about all the troubles overseas. So they're putting their hands in their pockets. They're not as keen to spend when they're a bit concerned about their future.
Well, obviously, Michael, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? And the other problem that Australia has economically is that we're seeing an easing in interest rates right across the board now. The US is set to cut rates again. Germany's cut rates. There's also now some quantitative easing processes being undertaken, because you've got to remember those European countries, or the Eurozone, has interest rates at around zero. And we have to, in a sense, follow that energy of lower interest rates, because that pushes currencies down. And we also need to keep our currency at the very least in balance with other currencies to remain competitive with our export.
The bottom line, interest rates are going to go down, but maybe they won't have the effect that the Reserve Bank's hoping for.
Well, I think it's clear from the latest minutes, Michael, that the Reserve Bank is determined to keep cutting interest rates until it achieves its aims, which is full employment, which I believe is something with a 4 in front of it, plus higher inflation and higher incomes growth as a result of that full employment. But the question is, what if it doesn't achieve that? If rates continue to be cut and we don't get that outcome? I mean, we're really left right in the corner then, with nothing left to stimulate the economy to address an external economic shock. And it's just something really we should have learnt from other advanced economies, that its monetary policy really is very insipid and certainly it doesn't have the impact it used to have in previous cycles.
Well, it'll give us something to discuss each week in these weekly Property Insider videos. Thanks for your input, Andrew.
Thanks, Michael.